Hello.
Hello.
How's it going?
Going good.
All right, all right. So we're gonna try something different today. We haven't done almost any philosophy stuff on our stream. We've mostly done, political rhetoric stuff. Today we're gonna try listening to a like a college lecture about moral philosophy, basically. And the idea is, I'm hoping not to just do like a video review of it, but I'm hoping it can kind of spark some discussion, and maybe this will work out well, and we'll get a good conversation out of it. And if so, there's lots more lectures like it. And if it doesn't work well, then okay, whatever. We'll move on to something else next week. I don't know. You got anything you want to say before we?
No, not really. I mean, I'm a big fan of philosophical debates and concepts and stuff like that, but I'm actually really uneducated on them. Like, I'm pretty illiterate when it comes to the actual, like, technical terms and stuff like that. So I'm excited to see what this is going to be about.
Okay. Well, let's give it a shot.
A philosophical discipline that's how we should live.
Oh, it's very quiet.
And
Sorry, every week I
categories
keep having to
encompass
ask you to turn it
really
up.
a
Sorry.
broad range of questions. On the one hand, because ethics studies how we should act, it will be concerned with what is the right thing to do in specific ethical situations or in ethical dilemmas. Is it ever acceptable to tell a lie? What should we think about controversial ethical issues like abortion and the death penalty? But because ethics is also broader, it also encompasses not just how you should act in certain situations, but it encompasses your life as a whole and really what the purpose of your life is. It's also going to ask the question, what are the most important things in life? What are the most important things that a human being should pursue? And what should a human life be oriented toward if it is a human life that is lived properly? So this is the domain of ethics. And the purpose of this video is going to be to give an introduction to the philosophical study of ethics by looking at 4 different questions that philosophers tend to ask about ethics. And each of these questions is going to give us insight into a different aspect of ethical thinking and a different aspect of what it means to think about how to live well and how to act well. So what are these 4 questions? So here are the 4 questions I have in mind, which I'll go through in this video. First, from an ethical point of view, one question we should ask is, what action will do the most good? What will produce the best consequences? Right, a very natural and common question to ask yourself when you're faced with a tough ethical choice, or you're deciding what you should do in a particular circumstances. Well, what will do the most good? What will have the best outcome, the best effect? What will increase the well-being of everyone involved? And this is a crucial ethical question. The second question we'll think about is a different way of looking at ethics. Instead of thinking about the consequences or the effect or the outcome of our actions, we might ask the following question. Is my action universalizable? Now, what does that mean? That's sort of a fancy philosophical way of just asking, could everyone perform the action I'm about to perform? So for instance, imagine you're thinking about, well, would it be acceptable to tell a lie in this instance? If you're thinking in terms of the first question, you might just say, well, should I tell a lie just depends on, will it produce happiness? Will it bring about a good outcome? But in terms of the second question, you might say, well, maybe the outcome is secondary. Maybe I should instead think, well, were I to tell a lie in this situation, would I be making an exception of myself? Would I be acting in a way that it wouldn't be okay for everyone in society to act? And if I am acting in that way, what makes me special? Why am I making an exception of myself? And that cluster of questions about universalizability, about performing actions that everyone can perform, is a second important question in the realm of ethics. A third question takes a more holistic perspective and focuses not so much on what is the right or wrong action in the realm of ethics, but it takes a broader view of our life as a whole. And this question is the following: what kind of character am I developing through my action? What kind of person am I becoming through my action? We might think it's not just important that we do the right thing, that we face ethical dilemmas and challenging ethical scenarios in a way that produces the best consequences or in a way that upholds our integrity by acting in a way everyone can act. We might also think it matters the way I'm about to act, how will that affect the person I'm becoming, the character I'm building, and hopefully the virtues I'm trying to inculcate in myself. The third question really does pertain to how do we develop ourselves as human beings? And this brings me to the fourth.
Can we pause for a second before we go to the fourth? So these first three that he's talking about here, these correspond very closely to three different schools of thought in terms of moral philosophy that I know a little bit about. And so it's like number one, consequentialism, number two, deontology, number three, virtue ethics, right? And it's kind of each one of those is kind of like, on the one hand, it's kind of a practical guide to moral decision making, but also on the other hand, like, people see these as kind of an account of human morality. And I don't know why people rarely seem to talk about how those things could be separable, right? Like, you could see one of these as a decently practical guide to decision making, but not an accurate account of human morality. But it seems like people usually take them hand in hand. I have a philosophy reading group that I do where I'm reading with a guy who's like really into virtue ethics and you know, takes it really seriously in terms of trying to behave in a way to cultivate good character, but that also believes that this is kind of an accurate ground level account of human morality. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on any of those?
Yeah, I just think these are... My only thoughts are, I wish that this was more well understood by more people. I really don't think that these concepts are difficult or hard to understand, but it seems like a lot of people just don't ever engage with these, period, which is a real deficiency sometimes in conversations. I don't know how many times I've had a conversation with someone and I'd be like, well, you know, what ought we do? And they're like, oh, well, I don't like philosophy. And I just start, tearing my hair out.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people are doing philosophy without realizing they're doing it a lot of the time anyway.
Oh, yeah. That is so true. I don't know if you've ever seen this infuriating video from Bill Nye talking about, like, oh, philosophy is good and all, but at the end of the day, the world is what the world is, and that's where we need science. You don't really need philosophy. It might be a fun thought experiment. It's like, that is a philosophical position, Bill.
Yeah. I think what people probably mean when they say that is the academic kind of philosophy that you would encounter at a university or talking with somebody who's really into philosophy or on our stream today. I think this is the kind of thing that some people really aren't very into, but it doesn't actually mean that they're not into philosophy, because everybody does have their own belief system and their own justifications for it, and typically most people like to talk about that and probably just don't think of it as philosophy even when they're doing it.
Yeah. To be fair, there is a real problem, I think, in more like academic philosophy circles of just like using unnecessarily complex words, or like the joke I always made with my friends, like, if philosophy was invented in the time in which we had computers, like, it would be standard practice for you to finish writing a philosophy paper and then set the font to like Wingdings or something. Like, there's so much like obfuscation that serves no actual purpose, in my opinion, anyways.
Yeah, and postmodernism is notorious for that. But I don't know. Do you have? Oh, and then another problem with it is that. So I haven't taken a bunch of college level philosophy courses, but when I've talked to people who have, what they say is that those courses tend to focus a lot on the history of philosophy, like as much or more than they focus on the ideas. And I think that's kind of a problem too. Like, I mean, I think there's a place for learning history of philosophy, but I think you should have like a separate history of philosophy class, and that if you just go to a philosophy class, that you should be learning mainly the ideas and only a little about how it connects to the history. But
Yep.
do you have an opinion on these three schools of thought and like favor one over another?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to be more of like a consequentialist type dude, but I think like consequentialism is really misunderstood, or at least like when I conceptualize consequentialism, it feels like people are never actually thinking about what the consequences would be beyond like a specific example. Like I think the classic example is like, well, if you're a consequentialist, don't you believe that, you know, anytime a hospital needs organs, they should just kill some person that's at the hospital as long as it saves, you know, 2 or more people? And it's like, well, no, because if you did that, no one would ever go to a hospital, and then lots of more people would die. So it's like I feel like there's always like a very like childish engagement with like these concepts, but I do genuinely believe that, you know, hey, if you're that the ends do justify the means. It's just you got to be really careful, you know, because that idea in and of itself could have an effect on, you know, if you're the kind of person that always feels like, oh, I am going to be the person that does the bad thing to do a good thing, well, then that might actually affect your calculus by which you evaluate whether or not the bad thing you're doing is worth, you know, what good are you getting out of it. You might start to really underestimate the badness of the action you're taking, overestimate the goodness you're getting out of it. So I think it's really important to have a balance. And of course, in the real world, also, you're never given the option of like kill 1, save 10. You're given the option, we're going to do this thing. It's going to have all these bad effects. And then maybe we start doing some good things. And if we can keep it rolling. So yeah, I just think that like the consequentialist idea is very true. But I think in practice, it actually ends up looking pretty similar to actually like what we have today, right? Like I think the classic example I always go to with my friends and in arguments, because I think it's a lot less incendiary, is something like the draft, right? I think something like the draft is pretty morally abhorrent. You're basically kidnapping your citizens. You're not just kidnapping them, you're then forcing them to do something incredibly dangerous. In the case of like someone who gets drafted and then goes to D-Day, you're basically being kidnapped and thrown into a human meat grinder. So it's pretty morally awful. But like, damn, when it's, you know, us or the Nazis are going to probably take over the world, you know what? I think I'm okay with the draft.
Yeah, so the example you gave with somebody like going to the hospital and just getting torn apart for their organs, it's funny because it's like this is like a really short-sighted version of consequentialism, right? It's like if you couldn't see more than one day into the future, what would you do? If trying to anticipate the consequences, right? But there's this irony to it where the whole idea of consequentialism is trying to anticipate what's going to happen as a result of your actions, and it's like if you're I don't know. It's like the antithesis of being short-sighted is the whole idea of it, and yet people characterize it in a short-sighted way.
Yeah. Very frustrating.
Yeah. So my own take is like different depending on whether I'm talking about like as a matter of practical advice versus a practical or versus like an account of human morality. Because like as an account of human morality, I don't actually buy any of these. I just think morals are not really real, and we just have the closest I can get is like we have social norms and we have preferences about which social norms we should have, and like that's as much as I can buy into as far as morality existing. And then in terms of like the practical decision making, I'm pretty sympathetic to either number 1 or number 3. Like, so either consequentialism or virtue ethics, I think are like a pretty adequate framework for moral decisions. I'm less sympathetic to deontology, the idea that you should have just strict rules that you follow all the time. But like, so consequentialism and virtue ethics, I think, are both flexible enough that you can like they're both just kind of loose frameworks that you can insert in a realistic set of human values, and in the first case it would be you use your whatever values you have to decide which consequences it is that you prefer over the others, and in the third case it would be to decide which character traits you would rather like to have than the others. but yet both of them are like structured enough to give you a good starting point for making decisions, and I think that's basically mostly what I would want out of a practical framework for moral decision making. It's like, give me a place to start, but don't dictate to me the answer in such a way that it doesn't allow me to that it doesn't accommodate what I care about.
Yeah. Someone in the chat says, "I hate philosophy not because philosophy is bad, because of the people who argue philosophy." So true.
Yeah.
So,
Same.
I mean, that just needs to be like a saying you can copy and paste, because there's a lot of things where that's, just the truest statement of life. So many things get ruined by the people who like them.
Yeah. I for sure had some bad experiences with philosophy bros. Like, not all the time, but like I remember, when I was in college, there was a guy, this guy I knew who was in the philosophy department. Like, he was just the type of guy that had like no real social skills at all, and would just like hound people with uninteresting questions, and then persist even when they didn't show any interest in what he was saying, and I don't know, it was like extremely annoying. But I don't know. Like, as I've gotten old, like, so my attitude at the time was like, oh, I just hate philosophy because of the personalities of the people who study it, and then as I've gotten older, especially, I definitely have an appreciation for the topic, and I sometimes like to have philosophy discussions myself, but hopefully not in in the way that guy did.
Why do the right thing at all? Why care about ethics? The first three questions were all certainly different from one another, right? They emphasize different aspects of ethical action. They might focus on character as opposed to discrete individual things that we do. But what unites 1 through 3 is that they all take seriously this idea of living an ethical life. They take seriously the idea that we should be concerned with doing what is right and good and just. But a broader question we can ask at an even higher level is, why should we care about any of that? If we start to think about ethics, we can immediately notice that in many cases, not lying, not stealing, not cheating other people, this can all come at a cost to ourselves. And if doing the right thing isn't going to benefit me, and if there are cases I could get away with doing the wrong thing, then why should I care about ethics and morals in the first place? What is in it for me? Why should I be the sort of person who's committed to doing the right thing? These are the 4 questions we're going to look at in this video, and the hope is that they will give us further insight into what it means to think philosophically about ethics and morality. Now, in order to further understand these 4 questions, we're going to consider one particular case that comes from our textbook. And this is the impaired driver case. So I'm first going to read through the case and give you a general sense of the situation. So here's the case. You've stayed about an hour longer than you intended to at a very pleasant party with your old college friends. While you were getting your law degree and starting practice, your roommate Marty made it big on Wall Street. He hosted the party in his huge Riverside Drive apartment. All the old college ties were there. Great memories, beer, booze, marijuana. Hadn't seen that in a while. Good stuff, too. Realizing you're late, you race to the parking garage, elevator to the 3rd floor, hop in your SUV, and tear around to the turn toward the exit. Smash! Car parked in just the wrong place. You hit it dead center. You back up, get out, note that there's extensive damage to the other car. Both doors on the driver's side badly dented, but none to yours. What should you do? You know damn well what to do. There's clearly damage, lots of it, so you have to take out your cell phone, call the police, and wait there till they come. Watching you propping yourself up against the SUV, they'll insist on the inconvenience of a breathalyzer test. When they get the results of that, they'll give you a chauffeured ride to the precinct station and insist further on a urine test. When they get the results of that, you may get to know the folks in the precinct very well before you see the sky again. You may very well, probably will, lose your license to operate a motor vehicle. The fines will be substantial, you may lose your SUV, you may even go to jail. the damage to your reputation and to your position in your law practice will probably be irreparable. Depending on the state, they may yank your license to practice law. That's a lot to think about. Meanwhile, you're the only occupant of this parking garage at this hour. You could just drive back to Connecticut and not say anything to anyone.
You want to pause
So
for
the
a
first
second?
thing to say about this case is there.
All right. Do you have any initial reaction to this situation?
Yeah, I mean, don't drive drunk, guys. That's really bad. Seems pretty obvious. Yeah, look, it might not seem like you've hurt anyone right now. Well, first off, you have financially, obviously, the person who owns that car. But the reason I think that you ought be obligated to turn yourself in here is because if you aren't capable of stopping yourself from doing this time, there's a pretty good chance you'll probably do this again. And if you don't face significant consequences for that, then, or even have your ability to do that, to drive at all, taken away, then you run the risk of doing that again. And at that point, you are risking not just your own life, but the life of others, right? You got lucky that no one was in that car this time, but there easily could have been.
Yeah, I think if you put yourself in the position of the other person, whose car it is, certainly you would want the person who hit your car to do that. I think it would be really, really hard to turn yourself in. You know, like if this were me, I mean, I don't even drink, right? So like, I'm not gonna be in this situation. But let's suppose I somehow did. I feel like I would be sitting there thinking like, oh fuck, I would agree that what I'm supposed to do is turn myself in, and it would just be like gut wrenching to have to do it, and I hope I would pull it off, but it's hard to say.
Yeah.
A number of different facets of it that we might take into account when we're trying to decide what should we do in this situation. First, there are a number of different stakeholders. Depending on what you do, it might have drastic ramifications for your life, your professional life, and maybe the income that could be supporting this person's family. On the other hand, the person whose car you have damaged, they also have a stake in the situation, given that, well, if you drive off, there'll be no one to pay for the damages. We might even think society as a whole has a stake in this matter, given that, of course, driving off would be against the law. Furthermore, if we're presuming that your time at the party has left you in an impaired state, then, of course, you getting back on the road, leaving the scene, and going to Connecticut could put other people in serious danger as well. And of course, the very fact that it's brought up that there's an option to drive back to Connecticut brings up the following question: should you care about anything else other than your own personal benefit? Even if you think it is wrong in actuality to leave the scene of the accident and to get back on the road, even if you think that's wrong, why again should we care about what is morally right? Why should we care about doing the right thing? So there are a number of different facets to this case, and the reason it's helpful is because, once again, it's going to help us to discuss the 4 ethical questions that I outlined previously. And that is to say, what action will do the most good? Is my action universalizable? What kind of character am I developing? And why should I do the right thing?
I think it's actually a little bit unclear which will do the most good here.
So to begin, let's start with question 1. When we're thinking ethically, we might ask ourselves, what action will do the most good? What will produce the best consequences? And again, I do think this is a natural way of thinking about the decisions we make. Because we say, look, each action we perform has some purpose, it has some end, it has some outcome. And so if the reason we perform an action is for the outcome, then I guess the actions we should perform are those with the best outcomes. Now, of course, this is just the beginning of the questions we need to ask, because even if we agree that what determines whether an action is right or wrong is whether it has the best outcome, we also need to ask, well, how do we know what the best outcome is? And here we can turn to really the classical statement of this approach to morality, which is found in an ethical theory known as utilitarianism or consequentialism. Right, and so the author of our textbook, Lisa Newton, explains that in classical utilitarianism, as set forth by thinkers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, the only consequences that matter are happiness and unhappiness, pleasure and pain for everyone affected by the act. So if we take what is known as the consequentialist view of ethics, which holds that all that matters is the consequences of our actions, or the utilitarian view, which holds that when we judge an action, we're judging its utility or its effect on overall happiness. What we're asking is, how can we act in such a way as to produce the greatest happiness for the greatest number of individuals? And again, the classic statement of this is found in the English philosopher John Stuart Mill. And in his book, Utilitarianism, he explains the theory in the following way, according to what he calls the greatest happiness principle. Mill tells us that the creed which accepts as the foundation of morals utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness.
Can
And
we
all
pause
this
for a
sounds
second?
great.
I sort of feel like the okay, if we're talking about the impaired driver thing where you hit the car and the decision of whether to turn yourself in, I sort of think if you were to evaluate that in terms of happiness and unhappiness that it's likely to produce, that's going to depend heavily on what type of personality you have and how much you're going to feel guilty about it if you if you were to just drive away, and the answer could be different for different people.
Yeah, I think it's also the big key, I think, to a lot of these sort of short-sighted applications is you need to think about not what you want to happen, but what is likely to happen in different scenarios. So, like, I think the classic of like, oh, I just drive home and no one gets hurt. It's like, no, you're gonna drive home, then there's a statistical chance that you will get into another accident or you'll do this again. And I think that's sort of where a lot of these evaluations fall flat. But no, in terms of the happiness thing, I agree. I think this is like I understand what they're trying to get at, but it's like this is not a good term. I think I think utility is a much better. This is like an actual place where using a philosophical word is a lot better when because happiness. I mean, that could mean a lot of things to a lot of different people.
Yeah, and well, in this case, I think they're using utility as a proxy for just happiness and unhappiness, right? Like,
yeah.
I mean, so when you say you'd rather use utility rather than happiness, why is that?
I think that if you say happiness, it's you have to sort of go through this whole rigmarole of being like, well, not actually just happiness, but like, people being hurt, stuff like that. And of course, a moral harm isn't, only dependent on whether or not someone is happy or not, or is like aware of it. I think utility is much better because it dodges a lot of those, like, I think happiness is just a bad word because it means something different than what you're trying to use it for in this context, where you're trying to say, well, we should weigh, the negative outcomes against the positive outcomes for individual people. There's a lot more to a positive outcome than simply making someone happy, or a negative outcome than simply making someone, sad. I think there's real moral weight to consider there in a way that isn't really encapsulated by the word happiness. Whereas like utility, I think is a lot better to describe a much more general concept of like good outcomes versus bad outcomes. And there's a lot of different things that could entail.
Okay, so it sounds like the point of view you're taking on this is like endorsing consequentialism, but rejecting specifically John Stuart Mill's version of utilitarianism, where he decides which consequences are good, just entirely based on happiness and unhappiness for the most people. Is that right?
Yeah, I think roughly that's probably pretty accurate.
Okay, so if happiness and unhappiness aren't your metric for deciding which outcomes are good, like, do you have like another one that you can spell out explicitly, or no?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to be able to spell out exactly what it is in terms of like all the examples, but I generally like to prioritize moral good over moral harm, which I know is a bit of a cop-out. But specifically, I like to not trade units. I think the example I always give for this is if you tell me we're going to kill one person to save 10, I'm totally fine with that. You never get those actual choices in the real world, but hypothetically, I would be totally fine with that. But if you tell me, because, it feels like those are similar units of moral harm or utility. But then if you tell me something like, we're going to kill one person to greatly convenience a billion people, Oh, I don't know about that. That starts to get a lot more dicey for me, because it feels like I don't know if there's any amount of convenience that could add up to the moral goodness of like a moral death. It feels like these are different units that aren't exchangeable. There's no rate at which I'm willing to, get a bunch of convenience in return for like, killing a person. So I think that's where I sort of start to draw the line. Is I'm totally fine, creating moral harm to prevent more moral harm, cause one death to prevent 10. But I don't know if moral harm of significantly different impact can ever be equivalent to each other.
So I wonder if convenience might be given like a little more moral worth than what you're saying, right? Because convenience has its own consequences. It means people have more time to do other things that they care about, and if you're convenienced, have a little more time to spend on whatever your profession is, then this could actually result in a small probability of saving lives, right? Like if
that was the case, then then at that point I think you're just back to the first question of, well, then
right.
You are saving lives. But I think the trouble is when we can't guarantee that, so we can't evaluate it. I think are you familiar with the idea of like risk adjusting in like finance?
A little bit. I don't know very much about finance.
The basic idea is if I tell you that you can flip this coin and on heads you win $100 and on tails you win $0, you can actually calculate the worth of that as $50. You can calculate the statistical average of right, and that's risk adjusting. I really like applying this idea to moral questions, because I think it really cuts through a lot of the ambiguity. Now the trouble is, oftentimes we don't have all the information to make a perfect calculation, so our calculations are still limited. But I still think it's really useful. Like in that example, okay, well, we're going to kill one person to greatly convenience a billion people. What's likely that leads to saving a person? Well, if we risk adjust it out, on average, are we going to be saving more than one person? Well, then by all means, go for it. I think that's sort of how I would tackle those sort of scenarios. But in a situation where you are assuming it's just convenience that isn't going to have any sort of knock-on effects for saving lives, that I still don't feel very comfortable sort of crossing that line.
So the concept you're talking about of risk adjustment, like I know this concept from playing poker. Like I used to play poker competitively, and the way I'm used to thinking of it is EV, like expected value, right? There's an average amount you expect to win or lose based on a particular play that you're making. But like, okay, so you were saying earlier, like, this answer that you described yourself as a cop-out, right? Which is like moral harm or moral good, right? And it seems like here, I'm going to bug you about that a little bit because
go for it.
This seems a little bit circular to me, right? Because if we're trying to figure out what is moral good and what is moral harm in the first place, and then we're from that we're going like we're going to decide what's moral good and moral harm by looking at the consequences, and how do we know which consequences are good? It's because of moral good and moral harm, right?
Yeah, I think when it comes to, I think I'm using this term correctly, but when it comes to like the sort of axioms of morality, I think I'm a moral nihilist. I don't really believe that there is such a thing as like moral truth. I just choose to value certain things, and then I sort of work my way from there. So like I value, humans not suffering. I value, preventing human suffering, stuff like that. I think that, I would to a lesser degree value, freedom or liberty, things like this. But if you ask me why I value those things, I don't really have an answer. And I would sort of go more on the offensive. Anytime someone's like, I can't believe you don't have a reason, I'm like, oh, no. You don't realize that you don't have a reason. That's what's going on here, because you don't have a reason either. I think this might be a little debate broy. But I think there is a really important thing to keep in mind in moral debates or philosophical debates, and I'll for if you ever are engaged with these, and that is that there's no moral system that escapes some really weird and bad stuff. Basically, there's no right, and anytime someone's asking, so under your morality, could you get to this, and it's a horrible thing, you need to be like, yes. But I think no moral system can escape really bad scenarios, and then you just point out, for example, a simple example for their moral system, something you have to keep in mind.
Yeah. So like you were saying, I think all of us actually have kind of values that are just grounded in our personality and our emotions at some level, that we're not going to be able to justify logically. It's like, yeah, why do we prefer pleasure over pain? Why do we prefer life over death and suffering over other? I mean, you can make up reasons for these things if you want to, but I think when people start making up reasons for these things, it's like, but that isn't really why you care about that, is it? Right? It's just because you're a human, you're experiencing human emotions, and you're just like preferring these things as humans normally do. Yeah, so I mean, likewise, I'm in terms of like metaphysical good or evil or like objective moral facts, I'm also a moral nihilist, but nevertheless, I do still care about ethics, right? I care about the discussion of how best to make decisions that embody our values. Then the other thing you were saying about like every moral system is gonna lead to some terrible thing, and I think this is true if you were to follow it super strictly. I think in practice people just don't actually follow their moral system super strictly. What they really do is they just have moral intuitions, and then they use if they have any awareness of moral philosophy at all, what they do is just use the moral philosophy to justify their intuitions, rather than use it to inform their decisions most of the time. But
yeah, there's a sort of line of argument that comes or in philosophy. I actually just had an argument with someone about this, pretty in depth, that sort of says, well, I just have my personal preferences, and one of those personal preferences is to appear consistent. Or to be as consistent as I can be. But even within that system, they'll say, well, what about this contradiction? Like, for example, the argument we were having was about veganism. Well, shouldn't you be a vegan? He's like, well, no, in that case, my preference for eating meat overrides my preference for being consistent. And I'm okay being a little bit of a hypocrite on this. It's a really interesting system. I don't agree with it, but I think it really, arguing with something like that really forces you to take a step back and sort of very concretely have all your foundations set out, all your ducks in a row, your T's and your crossed and your I's dotted, because logically it is actually quite a sound argument. So you need to really be able to step back and say, like, well, this is why we ought be consistent, and working your way up from your most basic positions all the way to like your most sort of like surface level positions about like actual applied ethics and how you should personally conduct yourself.
When you say it's consistent, were you're referring to the argument for veganism that was occurring, is that what you were saying was consistent?
Well, specifically, he was making the person I was arguing with was making the argument. I was presenting a case. Hey, I think that if you believe these two things, which I think all humans do, or most all humans do, then you're probably obligated to become a vegan. And he said, well, regardless if those arguments are true, there's a really easy escape to this, which is that I operate off of my preferences. I only want to be consistent insofar as I enjoy being consistent, right? It brings me some sort of, peace of mind to feel like, oh, I'm a logical, consistent, moral person. But in this case, the extra gratification I get from being consistent about veganism does not outweigh the lack of enjoyment I would get from becoming a vegan by no longer eating meat, which I enjoy.
That's probably a very honest answer for what it's worth. Because I mean,
it was a really good back and forth.
I think that really is like how people morally operate most of the time. It's even though they don't typically articulate it that way. But I mean, most of the time it's I think people just have these intuitions and they go, well, my intuitions must be reflecting some objective set of moral facts about the world, and therefore I'm going to use moral philosophy to describe what I think those facts must be. But really, like the entire exercise of doing that is motivated by my moral preferences and intuitions. I think that's I don't know. Well, anyway, you got anything more you want to add about this?
No, it was a very fun back and forth, and I think it's sometimes engaging with very philosophically different ideas is good, because they require you to sort of take a step back and reevaluate. It's sort of analogous to people often talk about how one of the problems with race realism on the internet was that everyone had taken for granted that racism was bad, that they kind of forgot how to argue against it. It's sort of a similar thing with like some of the anti-Semitism stuff with Kanye, where like when someone says, "Oh, well, I actually am a racist. I think racism is good," a lot of people will be like, "Oh, wait a minute, I'm not familiar with exactly how to argue that no, racism is bad." Or with the Kanye stuff, people are so used to sometimes just disengaging with anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that they don't have answers for questions that are at the very least real, right? Like it's a real question to ask, like, "Oh, well, why is it that Jewish people are so overrepresented in these certain sectors?" There's a real answer, by the way. It's the fact that Jews were literally excluded from every other industry, and specifically in banking, Christians themselves weren't allowed to do a lot of types of lending in the Middle Ages. Man, anti-Semitism just reads like a plot hole. I swear to God, the way in which it's like it's literally like, "Oh man, we hate the Jews. What? Why do you hate the Jews? Well, they control the banks. Well, why does that happen? We didn't let them do any other jobs, and we also didn't let anyone else do the job of banking. So they were the only ones that ever did banking, and they sort of just took over." What? Like it's so stupid, man. But anyways, that's just to say, if you argue with someone who's like, "Oh, well, actually, I don't have any moral beliefs. I just want to do anything that is, I find to be enjoyable," that can sometimes be really like, "Whoa, I'm not ready to argue this because I'm used to everyone assuming that yes, you should do something right, even if it's not good for you individually." It then forces you to readdress that. So going through those kinds of debates would be really healthy to sort of make sure you have a well-rounded comprehension of moral philosophy. In the same way that, if you don't argue in race realism all the time, you might forget how to argue that racism itself is wrong because everyone takes it for granted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Actions are to produce outcomes. And how do we know if an outcome is good? Well, what makes our lives go well? Happiness. What makes our lives go poorly? The lack of happiness or sadness. So it seems to just follow that when we're deciding what to do, we should ask, well, what will make everyone the happiest who's involved in the situation? Okay, so let's apply this to the present case, right? And let's ask ourselves, in the impaired driver scenario, what would a consequentialist do? If you're a consequentialist, if what you're saying is the decision we make is the one that will produce the greatest happiness for the greatest number of individuals, then how should we act in this situation? Well, here's what Newton says. She says, measuring pleasure and pain for all parties, including your family, the owner of the car, even the world at large, it looks like your best course is to take off for Connecticut without doing anything at all. Drive slowly so you don't get stopped. After all, the pain felt by the car owner upon finding his damaged car is nothing compared to the pain that you and your family would feel if you lost your ability to earn a living, let alone if you went to jail. Besides, his insurance would probably cover the whole bill. So when Newton looks at this case from a purely consequentialist perspective, purely from the perspective of what action will do the most good, she argues that the morally correct action from that point of view would be to drive off, go back to Connecticut, and say nothing. By doing that, you retain your job and the income that your family relies upon. And whatever pain the car owner would feel if you simply drove off is probably going to be outweighed by the pain that your family would feel by all of a sudden not being able to support themselves with a stable income. So if we just look at it from that point of view, it does seem that maybe driving back to Connecticut might produce the greatest happiness for the greatest number, even though it is illegal and even if it maybe feels wrong. Now, I think, interestingly, one aspect that Newton didn't mention is that, of course, getting back on the road would put you in risk of seriously harming other people, insofar as you're driving in an impaired state. So I think one question we can actually ask here about Newton's discussion of this case is, from a utilitarian, from a consequentialist point of view, does she really take into account all the various factors that could influence the happiness of everyone who has a stake in your decision? But even putting that aside, because it will always be difficult, I think, to predict the future and to know how our actions will affect the happiness of others when we're just sort of making a prediction based on probabilities of what could happen. So let's put that aside for the moment and let's think about a second question as well. Let's say we agree with Newton that if we're purely thinking like consequentialists, purely thinking like utilitarians, let's say we agree that the right thing to do is to drive away. Well, should this make us think about the consequentialist perspective on morality? That is, we might ask ourselves, is consequentialism right about what it means to act ethically? Because here it seems to recommend that we act in a deceptive way, that we break the law, that we act perhaps unjustly toward the owner of the car who we hit. How can that be the morally right thing to do? Now, these questions actually constitute a very common criticism of utilitarianism. And to understand this criticism of the consequentialist moral theory, I want to look at a second case.
Can we pause for a second? So about that first case, like, suppose somebody decides that escaping from the scene really is the outcome that's going to produce the most utility as they define it in terms of happiness. I would think what that should mean is that this person now thinks that that's a bad law. The laws that require you to report when when this type of thing happens, right? Because if you, in this case, are producing more positive utility by escaping, why wouldn't that be true of everyone else who's in, who hits a parked car? Why shouldn't all of them just escape?
Yep.
The innocent. So imagine you are a district attorney in a town where a tragic murder of a young child has occurred. You have no leads on who committed the crime, but suspect the person has already left town and that you will not be able to catch the culprit. Emotions are running high and many people are extremely angry. Suppose you know that the citizens will soon riot unless someone is arrested for the crime, and that if the riots occur, many people will be harmed and killed. You know that you could prevent the riots by arresting and charging one innocent person with the crime. Let's say this person is not particularly well liked by the other people in the town, and many people already suspect that he is guilty. So if you punish this person, nobody will find out that you punished an innocent person. Should you punish this innocent individual with the crime? So the situation is, you know that if you don't arrest and charge someone with this crime quick, there will be riots that could be deadly, that could cause property damage, that could cause a lot of pain and suffering. You start to think purely from a consequentialist point of view, purely in terms of what is the outcome, how can I create the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people? And when you do that, you might be led to the conclusion that, well, look, maybe I should just get the least popular person in town, who's, although completely innocent, nobody's going to ask any questions, and just charge them with the crime. Sure, maybe they didn't actually do it, but it will stop the riots, and it will create the greatest happidness for the greatest number of people in town.
I got something to say about this scenario, because I think this one is the idea of like giving into a threat from other people it makes it a pretty interesting thing, because I think basically whatever perspective you take on morals, there's if you strictly and rigidly stick to a particular system, then anybody who understands that you're doing that can manipulate your system in order to get what outcome they want. And I think this is maybe the people who are going to riot, maybe they aren't thinking of it exactly in those terms, but they are, if the idea is we're going to generate bad consequences so as to make you prefer one action over another, right? Like, you get where I'm going with that?
Yeah. I think this is a similar situation to what we described previously, which is like the problem is that like the consequences of doing this are further than just punishing one person and preventing it. It's establishing this precedent and this principle that could then lead to some really bad outcomes.
Right. And so I think that's a precedent that already exists in the world, though, right? Is that threats often are effective. And failing to give into a threat is going to have only some very small effect on whether there's a norm about threats continuing to be used in the future or not. So then at that point, it's not so much that you're creating or abolishing the norm entirely. It's more that just are you contributing for it or against it in some really small way.
I think you would need to, yes and no. I think that there is a further step than just than threats already existing if you're specifically capitulating like the justice system to like rioting, because I think that has then a high likelihood to mean that we're going to keep doing this in the future. The other thing that I think I guess this analogy doesn't answer is this our only choice, or could we seek to try and prevent the conditions by which a society constantly riots every time a decision that they don't like happens in the criminal justice system? But again, this is where I think part of the reason these questions avoid this is because it becomes a lot more complicated and difficult to say, which I think is representative of the real world and is why I think a lot of these questions don't actually apply.
I think it's interesting that they present this as a critique of consequentialism, but I think you could just as easily use it as a critique of any other moral system, right? Like, so suppose somebody believes in virtue ethics or whatever it is, you could still present this person with the same scenario and it would be just as bad for them, right? It's like, oh, okay, well then you're just going to allow the riot?
Yeah. I think it's an interesting question, but I actually do think there's a pretty simple answer.
Well, I don't, honestly. But I think, I mean, this is kind of just generally what I think about moral dilemmas most of the time, is that most of them are like, here's two bad options, choose which one you think is less bad. And then, of course, like, what happens in these conversations is you pick the one that you think is less bad, and then the answer you get is like, oh, but that one was really bad. How could you pick the really bad thing? It's like,
yeah,
well,
that too.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I don't think there is a super compelling reason to not just say either to not just basically make the case that you just need to evaluate what the consequences of this would be outside of just the specific example in regards to, is this going to become a recurring thing? If this is truly going to be a one-off scenario, then it's probably fine. But the problem is that, when we talk about moral codes, moral systems, those definitionally don't exist for only single scenarios. They exist to be applicable broadly, which then kind of makes you think, well, if you start engaging in this, even if you say, well, it's only going to be this one time, right? I mean, you're really not that different than the crack addict being like, well, after this, I'm definitely quitting. It might be, it's certainly to a lesser degree, but the reality is that taking moral actions has an effect on your feelings about said moral actions. And in this case, I don't really think you can avoid, the potential normalization. The question is, if you do this, what's the statistical likelihood that because you did this, we start doing more things like it or doing it again in the future? And if that is a significant likelihood, which I think it is, then it seems pretty simple to say, well, I'm not going to do this because if I do this, there's not just going to be one guy I'm throwing away. It's going to be all the guys in the future that are going to be being thrown away as a result.
Yeah, so I think what you're touching on there is the thing that they mentioned about deontology at the beginning, right? Which is the way that they put it in this video was coming up with rules that are universalizable. And I'm not particularly sympathetic to the idea that rules we live by have to be absolute and completely unbending and universalizable. But I think that's kind of just because it's going too far with a concept that does work, which is the way that which is that it does make sense to use induction to generalize whatever principle you're applying to one scenario probably applies to lots of other scenarios that fit the same description. And so this is like why we care about moral dilemmas in the first place, is because these are supposed to inform what type of moral system that we have. And then why do we care about what kind of moral system that we have, is because we can generalize that to lots of more situations. I mean, if we couldn't generalize whatsoever, then this would just be like, at best a fun thought exercise. But yeah.
Ensuring the safety and stability of all the citizens. Now, from a consequentialist point of view, that might seem great, right? You've reduced suffering, you've increased happiness. On the other hand, we might think about it just solely from the perspective of the innocent individual who just got arrested. After all, we seem to have this bedrock moral intuition that the guilty and only the guilty should be arrested and charged and punished for crimes. And that if you're innocent, no matter what benefit could accrue to society from you being arrested and punished, it is simply unjust. It is a violation of your individual rights to be arrested. So let's apply this to the consequentialist theory more generally. This just is a sort of structural issue with the theory. If all that matters is doing what is best for the majority, there's always going to be cases in which a single individual or minority of individuals can be treated poorly in order to benefit a greater amount of other people. And let's apply this back to the impaired driver case. We might say, look, let's accept the claim that the greatest happiness will be produced if you drive away from the accident. Maybe that's false, but let's just assume for the sake of argument that it's true. Isn't it also extremely unjust to leave the accident and leave the person who owns the other car simply hanging there with no one there to pay for the damages? Isn't that a violation of their individual rights? And this is a common criticism of this approach to morality, that while we are attempting to pursue what is best for the greatest number, there's always going to be some injustices to individuals that seem to be left in our wake.
Yeah, this still doesn't make much sense to me as a critique of consequentialism specifically, just because like the idea that you could have to choose between two bad outcomes, is applicable.
Yeah, there's a lot of like
them.
underlying work I think you need to do there. I also just think it's funny because I think that like I think almost everyone is actually a utilitarian. They just don't know it. When you look at the ways in which almost everyone is going to be willing to sometimes do a bad thing to do a good thing. They're just going to have different lines for where they think the utility, they're going to have different lines for where they think you can make that evaluation and where you can't. And I think a lot of the reasons why are themselves going to be utilitarian, that, if you do this, you'll become a bad person, which leads to bad outcomes. I think actually, in fact, now that I'm just thinking about this, I mean, the formulation I just made earlier about the previous example with regards to if you take this moral decision, it's going to affect you, and that's going to lead to moral outcomes. That's almost a consequentialist. Yeah, it's almost using virtue ethics in a consequentialist context. You're saying we should do virtue ethics because it has a real consequence to not do virtue ethics, which I think might genuinely be. I'm not super familiar with virtue ethics, but I think that would actually be distinct from a sort of more pure virtue ethics, which says regardless of the outcome, we should have this virtue.
You could describe any of these in terms of the other ones, right? Like so another common example you might come across is like rule utilitarianism, which is basically saying like we should behave as if we were deontologists and just follow strict rules, but the reason we should do it is because the consequences of doing that are good. It's like, but you could do the reverse kind of thing too, right? Where you could say like, well, we should consider the consequences of our actions, but the reason we should do that is because that reflects good moral character, and there is a virtue of caring about the consequences. You could put any of them, and that's why like all of these frameworks are flexible enough that you could describe pretty much any of them in these terms, which is both a good thing and a bad thing, right? Like it's bad because it means that. They don't really like answer moral questions particularly, right? Like all they do is just give you a starting point, but it's good because they do give you a starting point. And if you have like a good enough sense of your values and what consequences you care about, or what virtues you care about, or what actions you think are good or bad, then any of them is flexible enough to accommodate that.
You might be uncomfortable with the consequentialist approach to morality. You might say, look, there are certain laws, there are certain rules that are in place that are the bedrock of society and that we need to follow. You need to follow the law. If you cause damage, you need to take responsibility for it. These are just fundamental sort of rules or laws that we need to follow and can't just be sacrificed when it will bring harm to us or when it would be really inconvenient if we had to follow the rule. Now, if you're thinking along those lines, then maybe the second question about ethics is one that you think will be more essential and will be more appealing to you. What is this question? The question is my action universalizable? Which remember we just said is a way of asking, could everybody perform this action? And Newton begins to explain this approach in the following way. She says, yes, but think of it this way. The law is there for a purpose. What you are supposed to do as a citizen right now is call the police. That's your duty. You've enjoyed all the benefits of citizenship. Now it's time to honor your part of the bargain. And that sort of reasoning, the thinking that there are certain rules that we all need to follow and that we all need to do our part in following unconditionally, underlies a different approach to morality called a deontological approach to morality, which comes from the Greek word for duty. Now, the classic representative of the deontological approach to morality was a philosopher named Immanuel Kant. And to sum it up in one sentence, he said that morality really can be boiled down to what he called the categorical imperative. And he explained the categorical imperative in a number of ways, but here is one of the most famous explanations of it. Kant says, act only according to that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. Now again, that's some fancy philosophical language, but what does it mean? When you break it down, its meaning is actually relatively straightforward. You should only act in ways, you should only make decisions in ways that you would be comfortable and that you would think that everybody could act. The idea is that the way you live your life, the decisions you make, and the actions you take should not just be actions that are good for you, should not just be actions that are designed to bring you what you want, but should be actions that you would be comfortable with anybody taking. The way he sort of puts it here is that what you should do is imagine that the way you are about to act is about to become a law or a moral rule that everybody is going to follow. And then ask yourself, could my way of acting really be universal in that sense? Could everybody act in this fashion?
Can I pause for a second? One really obvious objection to this that comes to mind, he'll probably bring this up, but it's that people not only face different circumstances, but that people have different personalities and different needs and different values, right? And what's appropriate for one person to do may not be appropriate for another person to do, right? So like, suppose you're diabetic and like you need to inject insulin, and but you probably don't want to make it a law that everyone injects insulin, so it's not universalizable in that sense. So what you would have to do instead is make a law that everybody follows, that if you're diabetic, then you inject insulin, but then now you're effectively just going, this is, let me think, how do I put this? Like earlier he was saying, like, you unconditionally follow these laws, and yeah, the reason you can unconditionally follow that law is because it has a condition built into it, right? You're kind of just like shifting the words around in such a way to make it unconditional.
Now, Newton thinks that once we look at the situation from this perspective, she thinks we will see that the right thing to do is to not leave the scene of the accident, to take responsibility for the damage we have caused and call the police. Right? And here is the way that she explains it. What if everyone who got in an accident just took off? Would the world be a better place? Could you approve of a law that said when you find you've caused damage to life or limb or property, if it isn't convenient to stay around, just take off? If you can't, and you probably can't, then you have no right to make an exception of yourself in this case. So to a certain extent, the categorical imperative coming from Kant requires us to put ourselves in the shoes of others and really in the shoes of someone making rules and laws for all of society. And to be honest with yourself. Would you be comfortable living in a society where anyone at any time, whenever it would be inconvenient for them to take responsibility for what they've done, simply decided not to take responsibility? Not only would this be an undesirable society to live in, maybe not only would it be a society which lacked integrity, but we could quickly see how things would fall apart. It would be difficult to trust our fellow citizens if they knew they would never take responsibility for what they've done, and it simply isn't a rule or law that could govern a stable and peaceful social arrangement. So this is the idea behind the deontological approach and behind Kant's categorical imperative. And I think there are two important questions that we should really ask ourselves here at this point. The first question is, why should we care if our actions are universalizable? Right? I mean, it's common to say that you shouldn't act in a way that you wouldn't be comfortable with others acting, but why? What's actually wrong with it? And I think in order to gain some insight into this question, it can be helpful to use a concrete example. So let's say you're doing a project for school. Let's say it's a group project. You've all probably been in a scenario like this before at some point in your academic career. And we all know the sort of anxiety and the hesitation and skepticism about group projects. And why does that exist? Well, it exists for the following reason. Because we know there's a possibility of someone acting as a free rider. We know there's a possibility of someone saying, look, I could do the work I'm supposed to do, I could take my part, and I could do my part to ensure the success of this project, but I know everyone else is motivated to get a good grade, so if I don't do my part, they'll just pick up the slack, and I can get an A without doing anything. Right? We're all aware of this phenomenon. And the thing to think about here is, well, what is actually wrong with what this person has done? If you were that person's partner in a group project, how would you explain to them, not just from your personal annoyance, but from a moral point of view, why they are wrong to act the way they are acting?
They would just have to care about how it affects the other people in the group.
What makes them so special that they think they are allowed to act in that fashion? Notice that if everyone took this approach, if everyone said, I'm going to do nothing, relying on the other group members, the project would immediately fall apart. Which means the person who's not doing their part in a group project is really a parasite on everyone else. They seem to assume that they get special privileges to get an A without doing anything, that they're presuming the other people don't have those privileges. Because if other people did act in this way, if they took the privileges this person was taking for themselves, their own initial goal, their own initial plan would not be possible. The only way to get an A on the project without doing anything is for other people to pick up your slack. And I think what this shows is that the person who doesn't act in a way that's universalizable violates our intuitions about the fundamental equality of people. When I ask the question, what makes you so special? I'm asking the question, what makes you different? What gives you special rights? And if we think that all people are moral equals and no one should be more morally important than anyone else, then it's wrong of you to take rights for yourself.
Can we pause for a second?
That in principle could not be.
I don't think you have to actually believe that people are moral equals or anything like as idealistic as that. I think you just have to believe that people are similar to each other in their characteristics and they're similarly situated to each other. And so therefore, like whatever action is best for one person is likely to be best for another person as well, to the extent that they are similar.
I think you can also use arguments that are something. There's a very common way, I think, to get from egoism, I think is the term, to a more traditional worldview, which is basically just, if everyone acted in the way, if you promote this, other people are going to act in that way. And when they act in this way, it's going to be to your detriment, right? So like, it's sort of like a mutual buy-in. No one acts individually very selfishly, because the reality is that if they did that, other people would act selfishly, and those other people acting selfishly would be at the detriment of the original person. It's like, if I say, you know what, everyone should just do what I want, I should just be able to do whatever I want. Other people are going to be like, you know what, he's right. I should be able to do whatever I want. And then those people are going to do things that are to your personal detriment. When it seems like you can already optimize for like a pretty good conditions within a system where everyone's like has some give and take.
Yeah, so this is a thing that Destiny talks about, by the way, like sometimes is that he'll like describe himself as an egoist, but an egoist with an awareness of social norms, so that he wants to like live in the society that's best for himself, and therefore he wants to like set a relatively good example for other people. I'm not totally persuaded by that, but theoretically, like a person who is just only acting in their own self-interest doesn't have to be doing that at the expense of others. They could believe that living, in mutually beneficial relationships is the best thing for themselves. Yeah. And like earlier when I was kind of if I wanted to put each one of these three moral philosophies into a single piece of advice, like for consequentialism, it would be just like, think about the consequences of your actions and incorporate that into your decision making. And for virtue ethics, it would be like, think about how a good person will act, and also about how your actions will influence your character. And for this one, I think it's along that axis of like selfishness versus like altruism. It's just like, think about how what you're doing affects other people, and how you would see it from another person's point of view. And I think all of these are generally good pieces of advice.
Be had by others. I think that is one reason why Kant's idea behind the categorical imperative really has a strong intuitive pull. There's a second important question to think about here as well. Let's say we accept that the categorical imperative is a true guiding principle for ethics. We might also ask the question, has Newton applied it correctly in this case? Right, Newton says that leaving the accident would not be a universalizable action. And remember, the idea behind universalizability is we say, look, if everyone were motivated in this way, if this is the purpose everyone was trying to achieve, would that be possible? Could we all live in a society like that? And notice how she describes the fundamental motivation behind the action. When you find you've caused damage to life or limb or property, if it isn't convenient to stay around, then just take off. She's supposing that the fundamental motivation here is just to avoid inconvenience.
Oh, can we pause for a second?
If we imagine
so what I wanted to point out is the way that she put it was she put a non-universalizable condition into her statement of what's supposed to be a universalizable piece of advice. So like there has to be something wrong with this, right? Like I think there's going to be different ways of describing what the problem is, but
I even noticed that. You're right.
Society where anyone who found that it was inconvenient to follow the law simply broke the law, then society would break down very quickly. That certainly would not be universalizable. But I wonder whether there's a different way in which we could describe the situation. Maybe the motivation behind the action isn't quite so clear-cut. Instead, we might say something like this. Whenever I need to break the law or evade responsibility for harm caused in order to avoid serious hardship for my family, then it's acceptable to do so. Now, is that a universalizable action or principle? It might be. Cases like that may not be all that common, they may be relatively rare, and we might be able to imagine a society or a stable social arrangement where the vast majority of the time people follow the law, but in extreme and very unique circumstances where breaking the law was necessary to prevent great hardship to one's family, then one said, well, it's acceptable to break the law. It might be possible we could live in a society coherently where everyone was able to follow that principle. The main point being here is that when we're thinking about whether an action is universalizable, we need to be careful, and we really need to think about how are we describing the action and how are we describing the motivation behind that action. Our discussion on the first two questions about ethics has really focused on the question of how to act well, or what is it that makes an action morally good or morally bad. Is the moral status of an action determined by its consequences? Or is the moral status of an action determined by whether acting in that way would be possible for everyone? Whether that action could serve as a stable rule that all people could follow? But the third question, I think, asks us to take a broader view of ethics. And instead of just asking the question, well, what makes an action right or wrong? Let's ask a question about people. Let's ask a question about character and the relationship between how we act and who it is that we are becoming. So more specifically, the third question is, what kind of character am I developing through my actions? What kind of person am I becoming through the way that I act? And this approach to ethics is classically seen to be given by the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, who, as opposed to the teleological or deontological approaches we've seen thus far, had an ontological approach to ethics. It wasn't about your actions primarily, but it's about who you are as a person, your very being as a person, as Newton explains in our textbook. Now, in order to understand what Aristotle had to say about ethics, I want to look at a few passages from his most famous work on ethics, the Nicomachean Ethics, where he talks about the process by which we develop a virtuous character. So a couple of main elements of his ethics. First, what he thought the purpose of ethics was to inculcate virtues, which are good traits of character, and avoid having vices, which are bad traits of character. And so the question is, well, how do we become virtuous? How do we fill our character with virtuous traits like honesty and justice and kindness and courage? Here's what Aristotle says. He says, virtues arise in us neither by nature nor contrary to nature. But nature gives us the capacity to acquire them, and completion comes through habituation. Virtues we acquire by first exercising them. So here's the question. You might ask, are human beings naturally good or naturally bad? And then Aristotle says, well, neither. We're not naturally good or naturally bad. It's not like human beings are inherently evil. We're also not inherently angels. What we are by nature are the kind of being and the kind of individual that can become good or can become bad through our actions. Whether you develop a good character or not is up to you. It depends on how you act. And how is it that we develop those traits? He says it's through habituation or through habit. And in this sense, for Aristotle, developing a virtue is very much like developing a skill, like learning how to shoot at basketball, or to carve something, or to paint, or any other sort of skill, or play a musical instrument. The way you get better at it is by practice, exercise, and developing good habits. So he tells us that we become just by doing just actions, temperate by doing temperate actions, courageous by doing courageous actions. If you want to be a courageous person, then get out there and face danger in the appropriate circumstances. And if we do that over and over again, we'll develop a sort of habit for virtue where we won't even need to think about how to act anymore. It'll just become a part of who we are. And one outcome of this is, he says, if you train yourself properly, if you build the right habits, you will actually take joy and pleasure in virtue. And in fact, Aristotle thinks if we come across someone who says they're virtuous, but doesn't like to do the morally right thing, doesn't take pleasure in doing what's morally right, then that's not really a virtuous individual. Aristotle tells us,
That's
for
kind
no
of a
one would
hot
call
take.
a person just if he did not enjoy acting
Yeah, I don't know
justly,
about that.
or generous if he did not enjoy generous actions. And the same goes for the other virtues. And we can see why this would be the case. If what ethics is about
I'd
is
probably give
building
more
a certain
credit to
sort of
somebody
character,
who does
and what
virtuous
it's about
actions
is
despite not
having a
enjoying
character
it.
where virtue and morality is just a part of who you are, then acting in the right way, acting justly, acting kindly, acting generously, acting courageously, should not be some foreign demand on you. It shouldn't be an imposition on you that you find annoying. If it's really a part of your character and who you are, you should take joy in it. You should take pleasure in it. You should enjoy and take pleasure in doing the right thing. And all of that comes through habit. And you've probably had that experience in your life just with very simple things. There might be a food that you didn't like at first, but Through time and habituation, you came to enjoy it. The same with other sorts of activities. And Aristotle sees ethics and development of a virtuous character in just the same way. Now, what does this have to tell us about the impaired driver case? Well, as Newton explains, when we apply this to concrete situations, we might say, well, maybe instead of trying to focus first on the action, focus first on your character. And ask, depending on how you act here, what sort of person are you likely to become, and what might other people think about what sort of person you are? So, Newton explains this in the following way. How would you explain it? How would you explain your action? How would you justify taking off like that when you were clearly in the wrong? If that scenario doesn't suggest an approach to the problem, put a reporter from the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal sitting beside him in another chair. The reporter is going to describe the whole situation, including your reasons for acting as you did, in the newspaper tomorrow on the front page. What kind of person would you look like in that story? Is that the kind of person you want to be? If you're talking to this news reporter and you say, yeah, I mean, I did cause a lot of damage there in that parking garage, but I just left the scene of the accident because it would be inconvenient. I didn't want to suffer harm and hardship and lose my job, so I just cheated that person out of the repairing the damages to their car. How would people react when they read that?
Can we pause for a second?
If you were really
I don't think that that's really like a fair description of what somebody would probably have going through their head if they did decide to leave, right? Because as I recall, the scenario as originally described was that you've got a family to take care of and they're depending on your income, right? So so what kind of person might flee? Somebody who thinks that their families caring for their family and in that way is more important than being honest or considerate to the person whose car you hit. And I think, in this case, it's just two competing virtues.
Yeah, I think this is I think what I thought he was saying, and this is what I would agree more, is this is what the person is actually doing, and they're sort of engaged in a self-delusion when they're saying, oh, well, it's not a big deal, no one got hurt. But no, I'm realizing that that's not really what they're saying. They are more making an authoritative claim of what the person is thinking, and I don't think that's correct. I think it's a fair criticism to say this is what you're actually doing, and you're just sort of self-rationalizing it in a way to feel differently. But even that is very distinct from someone, full-chested being like, yeah, I'm stealing from this person. Ha 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 ha.
That's true. That's true. Like if you just drove away and you're like, fuck that person whose car I hit. I mean, there could be a person who has that attitude about it, and then virtue ethics is definitely going to distinguish that as like a person of different character from someone else who made the same decision, but because they care about their family.
Is lying to themselves as well. It's like, oh, it's not that big of a deal. No one was in the car. Like, it's still important to distinguish between the motivations for an action, even if it's the same action.
Yeah.
Forced to confront the fact that is what you did. How would you feel about your action? And another thing to think about here is if our actions influence our character, the next time you are in a situation where your integrity is tested, will your character be stronger or weaker? Will it be easier for you to give in temptation, or will it be harder? And of course, the answer seems obvious. If you make a habit of giving into temptation, if you make a habit of sacrificing your integrity, it's just going to be easier in the future. And that simply is the road to developing a vicious and not virtuous character. All three of the ethical questions we have discussed thus far take a different approach to morality. But despite those differences which we have discussed, they're also united by something very fundamental. All three of those questions are questions which should challenge us. The first and second question about the consequentialist and deontological approaches to ethics both challenge us to put aside our self-interest and think about others. They each do this in a different way, one based on outcomes and effect and consequences for the happiness of our fellow citizens, the other focused on saying that you can't just do what you want to do, you have to follow some stable rules and principles. But in either case, both of those approaches challenge us to put aside self-interest and think about a greater good. The third question about what sort of person am I becoming, and the question about character development challenges us really to be the best sort of person we can be. For Aristotle, he saw ethics and morality as necessary to human flourishing and human excellence. So all three of those questions, if we take them seriously, ask us to challenge ourselves to live better ethical and moral lives. But then there's the specter of a fourth question that's looming behind all this. And if challenging ourselves in this way, if engaging in sacrifice means putting aside some of what we want, putting aside some of our satisfaction, then we might ask, well, why do we have to do the ethically right thing? Why do I have to challenge myself? Why do I have to sacrifice for others? Why can't I just live life in a way where I do what I want to do that's best for me and get away with breaking moral rules where I can? And this is the fourth question I want to look at. Why do the right thing? Why care about ethics? Now, there's a lot that could be said about this question, but to conclude, I just want to look at one passage from a philosopher named David Hume, who was especially interested in this question. And Hume was talking about a phenomena that he called the sensible knave. So who's the sensible knave? It's just someone who follows the moral rules where they have to, but at every turn they break them when they think it will benefit them. So in the impaired driver case, the sensible knave would be someone who says, look, I'm going to leave this accident not because I think it's the morally right thing to do, but because I think I can get away with it. Because I don't think anything bad's going to happen to me if I do it. And if I stick around at the scene of the accident and call the police, there's going to be a whole lot of consequences for me. So the sensible knave knows what the morally right thing to do is, but they simply do not care. They break the moral rules whenever they think breaking those rules will benefit them. And what Hume does in this passage is that he gives some reasons famously for why it's not in our interest to act like a sensible knave. So here's what he says. He says, these sensible knaves will discover that they themselves are, in the end, the greatest dupes, and have sacrificed the invaluable enjoyment of a character, with themselves at least, for the acquisition of worthless toys and gewgaws. So what is he saying here? He says the sensible knave, by breaking the moral rules whenever they think it will benefit them, has given up something more valuable for what is less valuable. The sensible knave lies and cheats and steals to get money, let's say. What Hume is saying is that money that they gain through being ethically bad, through breaking the moral rules, is not worth what the sensible knave has to give up. Well,
I think there's a little bit of a presumption here that, that's necessarily going to eat at people in all ways. And I think it also opens you up to a bad scenario where it's like, well, unless you're a psychopath, in which case, being a knave is super cool because you'll never feel bad.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's true, but you might ask, well, what exactly is the sensible knave giving up? And Hume gives the following answer. He says, above all, the sensible knave is giving up peaceful reflection on one's own conduct. What comparison, I say, between these and the feverish, empty amusements of luxury and expense? The pleasures associated with having peaceful reflection on our conduct, he says, are really without price. There's a certain sort of priceless enjoyment to knowing that we have done the morally right thing. There's a certain enjoyment to knowing at the end of the day that we can look ourselves in the mirror and saying, I acted in the ethically correct fashion. And I think this is an important point because it puts an interesting twist on the way that we normally answer this question. Normally, if we ask ourselves, why do the right thing? We might say something like, well, if you did the right thing, your conscience would eat at you. It would be painful for you in the aftermath of this to know that you cheated someone for your own benefit. And I think that's true. I think that we do have a conscience, and when we do something wrong, it does make the aftermath of that decision unpleasant for us, and the guilt does get to us. But Hume is saying something more than that. He's saying not only is it painful to do the wrong thing, but it is enjoyable to do the right thing. There's a positive enjoyment associated with knowing you've done the right thing. And no matter how much money you can gain by doing the wrong thing, no matter how much power, no matter how much influence, no matter how much material benefit you can get from breaking the rules, it does not compare to the enjoyment you can get from knowing you've done the ethically and morally and virtuously correct action. Now, this is a strong claim. It does mean that there's no amount of material benefit that would be worth sacrificing the enjoyment of your character. But at the same time, if Hume is right, then ethics itself takes on a whole new character. Ethics is not just a set of arbitrary rules that we have to follow that are an inconvenience. It really is something that contributes to our happiness, our enjoyment, and our flourishing.
The utilitarian argument for ethics.
All roads lead to utilitarianism.
I think what he's saying is kind of like generally true of the vast majority of people, that if you behave according to your values, then you'll you'll experience a life that a life of more positive emotions and fewer negative emotions. But that's not to say that your values have to align with what you see as moral, right? Because there certainly are people who believe that, in social norms or objective moral facts, but don't care about them. And I think Hume's argument just doesn't actually apply to those people, because those people aren't actually going to be happier. Well, somebody who feels conflicted between those two things, it might apply to. But somebody who genuinely just doesn't care about morals or social norms despite believing in them isn't actually going to be happier if they go with that. They're going to be happier if they pursue whatever their own values are, even if those are extremely selfish. And I think that this is probably a very small minority of people for whom that's true. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. No, yeah, there's a big presumption, I think, sort of similar to arguments like, people will sort of have these ideas about karma, or what goes around comes around, and these are sometimes useful, but I don't think they're universally true. There seems to be this desire to sometimes want to make the world right via some belief in like cosmic justice, and I think you sort of see a bit of that when he says, oh, well, anyone who acts bad, deep down, they're going to feel bad, and that's going to eat them up inside. That is true sometimes, but not all the time. Sometimes there really are heartless people out there. So I think relying on that as a sort of way to disprove that isn't to disprove the idea of being the knave, of being someone who just acts in your own self-interest, even when it's not necessarily moral, is bad, because it just isn't going to always be true. You're going to run into some person that's like, well, I don't feel bad, so Giga Chat, I'm just going to do it anyways. I think that's why you can get to a lot more useful arguments when you say, well, even in your own self-interest, it is to act within our society as a selfless person is within your self-interest, because otherwise it'll all start to break down. You can already optimize pretty well to live a really good life in our current system.
Yeah, so now I'm thinking about like heaven and hell and why those are kind of powerful ideas, right? Because if you do believe in heaven and hell, then you could just be whatever Hume called it, right? The sensible knave, and you could still believe that you ought to believe in according to Christian virtue just out of self-interest. Like regardless of feeling happier about it or not. So I think there's some usefulness to getting people to behave that way, even if it's only probably a small number of people who need that, right? Because I think most people generally want to behave in pro-social ways, regardless of believing in heaven or hell or not.
Yeah.
But there probably is a small number of people who need that.
Yeah, I think there's thank God humans have sort of evolved to be a cooperative species, and we've got real social interests in being friendly. Because otherwise, man, I don't know what this world looks like, a really different world if we're not.
Yeah, some of this stuff strikes me as like wishful thinking, right? The like you're gonna regret it or you're gonna go to hell or whatever. It's like I wish the world worked in such a way that people got what I think they deserve in air quotes, but in reality, that does not appear to be the case. It's as far as I can tell.
And that's not to say it never happens, right? I mean, like people have PTSD and from sometimes horrible stuff that they experience, but you shouldn't rely on that as a reason, because that in of itself sort of is selfish. Why should I be selfish? Well, it actually won't be good for you. Well, that sort of still is in a way almost selfishness.
Yeah. I mean, it's like two different levels of selfishness, though, right? It's like, why shouldn't I be selfish with respect to these particular day-to-day decisions? And it's like, because that conflicts with selfishness in a different domain of this like meta level awareness of your actions or in the the consequences.
I just think it's kind of funny that Hume's point almost is like, well, that's not the correct way to be a selfish knave, because actually it'll hurt you in the long run. You need to optimize better. Here, do this.
Yeah, exactly. All right, well, I think we're about done for today, unless you got anything else you want to add?
Nope, I don't think so.
No? Okay. Thanks for joining us, and do you want to shout yourself out?
Yeah, twitch.tv/Flowtrace, twitter.com/Flowtrace. Setup coming soon, TM, and see you guys next week.
All right, see you next week.